perhaps because I've lived in so many places, I'm able to introduce myself to various different kinds of people. I have an appreciation of different cultures and understand the importance of making an attempt to understand different audiences. That certainly aids me in advancing my why as I move on my own public advocacy journey. For me, looking at patterns in my life also aided me in developing my why. Recurring themes in my life included autism, caregiving, cultural stigma, accessing the healthcare system, community, and most importantly, hope. For you, it will likely look different, but seeking out those recurring themes may prove quite helpful on your journey. A decision to go public in your advocacy walk shouldn't be taken lightly. It is my advice to you that you consider a cost-benefit analysis as well as you proceed, because preserving and maintaining your mental health is paramount. The decision to go public with our multi-generational autism story was based on discussions between my husband and I, where we asked ourselves some questions, some tough questions that included some of the following that I'll share with you. What are the downsides to sharing your story? What could be the worst case scenario? Do you have the resources needed to handle it? What happens if your story truly does resonate with an audience? Have you established the type of boundaries you need to stay the course? These can be tough questions because, again, this looks different for everybody. For me, because cultural stigma was a recurring theme, there were some well-meaning people in our community who were concerned that once we went public, people in the community might shun us because there are still parts of the community I live in that believe that people with differently wired brains and people with disabilities should stay hidden. And making sure you have the resources needed to handle this includes making sure you do have strong community members around you in case there might be some type of opposition that you can't foresee, people that can be your safe space, or perhaps a counselor. These are all important because the advocacy journey should be seen through a long-term lens, even if it does end up to be only a season. So once these questions or questions like these have been considered and contemplated, and you've decided that a public advocacy walk might be right for you, you can think about how your messaging can be tailored for an audience. Perhaps how can your message be delivered to more than one audience? This, of course, is always subject to change. But our family chose to tell our story via multiple mediums. Audio podcasts, in-person speaking opportunities, and written articles. This again can look entirely different based on comfort level, preference level, etc. Sometimes we choose to tell the same story but in different mediums, or maybe forms of the same story. For example, for us, we shared a story about travel and the importance of incorporating universal design principles into the travel experience for families with autism and intellectual disabilities. And this story took on a multi-generational. It begins in the 1990s in Paris, where unfortunately my very tired mom took my young brother, and it was just the two of them, to Nigeria. there was a layover in Paris, and my brother had fallen asleep, and somehow, some way, my mother fell asleep as well. And she woke up, and she could not find my brother. She cannot speak French, so the language barrier was there. And she was searching through an airport for a child with some severe sensory challenges. We now know them as sensory challenges, but back then we didn't know how to classify them. She was in complete fear. Her, with the help of security, that again, there was a language barrier, they eventually found my brother, and he was going up and down the escalator in Charles de Gaulle Airport. Up and down the escalator. And now that we know more about autism, my brother woke up in a strange place, and he probably went to the escalator because there was some level of familiarity there for him. It's one of his, he really enjoys two things: being driven in a car and going up and down an escalator. So we decided that that story was best in written form, because we tied it in with the present day, with my children, and how my children started to develop some of those same sensory challenges. But we're growing up in a slightly different era where people are more aware of what autism is. So knowing that, through working with things like social stories and great occupational therapists and behavioral therapists, our children currently are able to travel long distances. One such wonderful vacation we were able to make was to Jamaica, where we went to the first autism certified resort in the world, I believe, at that time. So we tied those two stories together in a written form. However, for the audio podcasts, at first I thought the most powerful way to convey the story would be to interview certain family members that were integral at that time to the story. But because it's such a sensitive story, and even though it happened a long time ago, it's still hard to convey that type of hurt and fear and trauma. We decided to keep it in written form. And the audio podcast then became mostly about my nuclear family, the one I created. So more focus on the trip to Jamaica and how my husband and I vetted the resort staff and all of the wonderful services they provided us there. And the reason why there's still some fear also and trauma attached to that original experience is, over time, unfortunately, my brother used the plane less and less. And now his means of travel is mainly by car. So because of that sensitive subject, we chose to convey a very powerful story in two different ways. But that's just one example. Obviously, yours would be different. So the importance of recognizing the lane you're in is very important. Everyone has their place in the neurodiversity movement. I strongly believe that. But there is this clear difference between advocacy and self-advocacy. Advocates have a rich history of speaking for self-advocates. So the goal is to make sure that we can check ourselves, to make sure we are speaking on our own personal stories and perspectives in a way that can uplift others. On my podcast, I have been blessed enough to speak with some self-advocates, and there have been times that I have been corrected, and I learned a lot from it. I wasn't offended. It was done in a very respectful way. I remember asking a prominent self-advocate of when she started to lose some speech before she became the great orator she happened to be today. And I asked her if she remembered losing that speech and what that meant to her. And she paused and she respectfully let me know that People ask her that all the time. And she always found that odd because she wonders if neurotypicals were asked if they remembered things at age 2 or 3. And I paused and I thought to myself, point well taken. Another example was the maturity and brilliance on display by a budding self-advocate, then age 12, who was interviewed for a podcast along with her mother. The way she described masking as a young person on the verge of adolescence was beautiful to behold, and something I think about as I raise my now teenage son and preteen daughter. There's a lot to be learned from one another. I hope that public advocacy increases. I hope more of us do speak our minds. But I hope that as this happens, we remember that there is a lot to be learned from one another, and we keep that in mind. Rich debate is important for progress, but disdain for one another can threaten the future growth of this movement. Something to keep in mind as I proceed with my advocacy, whether it be in real life or via social media. I've covered different kinds of questions and scenarios to contemplate and perhaps implement if it is the right fit for you as you think of your why and think of ways to either start or further your advocacy journey. And as you do so, please consider doing a consistent check on yourself and the reasons behind your advocacy with tools like that emotional cost-benefit analysis I brought up, or the internal audits of a different kind that I brought up earlier. Because preserving and maintaining one's mental health is key on this journey. It is so key. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care. And please be well.